Well, welcome back to, this is week 2 of our new series in 2 Samuel. We have chosen the title from the new Netflix series, is that next week? But they are stealing all of the material from the Bible, so I think that is okay. And this week is like the special bonus episode for the premium subscribers, that's you. Because you can see from all the stuff around us that 9:30 had some holiday club business to finish up, and they've had a fantastic week in the story of Joseph, back when there were only 12 sons, and they were in the wrong country, and all they had was some promises of a land, a king, and a blessing. Well, by 2 Samuel chapter 10, we're on page 313, you can now see it all coming true. Everything that's sort of promised in the throne and the crown behind me. The shepherd boy has become king. David, he rules in Jerusalem, and he now has fresh promises. And last week we compared 2 Samuel 7, that's his promise chapter, with Psalm 2. Psalm 2. David is the poet king, the singing king, and the book of the Psalms give us his theology and his heart. So there's a selection up on the screen. It imagines all of the kings of the earth in rebellion to destroy God and destroy his anointed king. And actually in 2 Samuel 10, we get close. Maybe this was in David's mind when he wrote the song. It just keeps escalating in our chapter, doesn't it? Until you have 7 armies in the field of battle. And it looks like David's kingdom will be crushed before it properly starts. But Psalm 2 behind me, Psalm 2 says that God has made his decision. God is going to have his king. That is the most certain thing now in all the history of the world. It will be David and his son after him. God has a plan. God has a plan to do good to his world. It's a staggeringly generous plan. Even in Psalm 2, even the rebels who want to kill him can be forgiven and become friends. Psalm 2 is a second chances psalm. He talks to the rebels, says, "Be wise, you kings. Kiss the Son. Take refuge in him." But God's plan to do good to his world is a king. I think today we would send an aid worker or a doctor or a teacher, and Jesus, he is all of those things as well. But above all, he is God's king, securely on his throne. Which means there are only 2 options for every other ruler and authority, including me and you, in our claim to rule ourselves and our lives. It means there is the easy way or the hard way. So last week, dead dog Mephibosheth, he showed us how good it is when you take the easy way. His dad Jonathan laid down his crown and swore an oath to David as king, when David was really a nobody. And we saw last week, Jonathan made the right choice. He was a wise king. And all of his family, they now take refuge in David and are blessed. Mephibosheth, he was offered faithful covenant love and kindness. And now he sits at David's table as a son. I hope you've been sort of dining out on chapter 9 all week. But this week, we've come to see what happens to the unwise king. If you look down at verse 2 in chapter 10, you'll see we're on the same script. David, he's the king of kindness, and he wants to show kindness to another surprising individual. Here we go. It's not working. There it is. The king of kindness, except this time, it's about what happens if an unwise king says no. What if he chooses the hard way, not the easy way? Is it possible to reject God's choice of king? So, the king of kindness. Have a look down, page 313, and our story opens with a new king in a place called Ammon. This is just normal everyday politics. The king is dead, long live the king. The Ammonites, we've heard about them before. They've got connections to the people of Israel. Ammon was the son of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. But they have been normally the enemy in most of our time. King Nahash, who we've got here, he invaded back in 1 Samuel 11. It was the first good thing that Saul did was defeat him. But now he's dead, and his son Hanun is in his first 100 days on the throne. And just like last week, there is a sort of playbook for how this should go. I think by the end of this series, you will know exactly how to be an Iron Age king. I don't know why you would want to do that. There's not many openings left for that, but all of the playbook is here. So when your neighbor king dies, you have an opportunity. Back at home in Ammon, chances are there are 5 other blokes who think that they should be king instead. Probably everyone who was driven out of the country by his dad are now coming home. And everybody who just sort of stayed in the fold because they were scared of his dad, they are now looking at their options. And if you are a neighbor and you are strong and you have an army that is on a roll, and that is absolutely David, then you take your chance. At the very least, you are going to move that border and snatch some plunder. There are going to be towns, fortresses that Nahash took from you, and you can at least get them back. I wonder, it's been half term, hasn't it? Anyone go and look at the beautiful, picturesque castles on the Welsh border this half term? Anyone do that? That is what this is all about. The only reason they are there is 300 years of pushing that border one way and the other. And it is not just greed. This is basic survival. If Nahash took the high ground, then you are at a disadvantage and you need it back. If you don't take your chance now, the next thing you know, the son will be firmly established and his tanks will be on your lawn, and he'll be looking for a way to prove that he is as big a man as his dad. So there's a playbook. But just like last week, David got it wrong last week. You're not meant to be kind to the grandson of the old king, but he was. And this week you are meant to strike when your neighbor is weak, and he doesn't. Verse 2, David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. And so many parallels. The same key word as last week in 9 verse 1. It's the same reason even. It's because of something his dad did. So let me be kind to the son. Nahash was probably helpful when David was on the run. He was Saul's enemy, so he probably gave David safe passage or a place to hide. And we said last week there's a translation problem with the word kindness. To English ears, it just sounds like you gave up your seat on the tube. Yeah, thank you very much. But this is one of the big Bible words. Gets translated love or mercy or loving kindness or covenant faithfulness. David is offering Hanun a relationship, securely bound with covenant oaths, in which David does good to Hanun, even when the playbook says that he should do the opposite. This is far, far more than Nahash ever did for David. He offers him kindness, plus verse 2. He offers him sympathy, and verse 3, he's offered him honor. And we should be surprised, not only because it goes against his self-interest, but because of who Hanun is. At least Mephibosheth was from within the people of God. But this is an offer of kindness to a Gentile, to a country that normally were the enemy of the people of God. And they weren't even a nice enemy, if that means anything. Write down 1 Samuel 11 in your notes, and you can look at that later. It goes back to a time when Nahash offered to make peace with an Israelite city, by which he meant conquer it completely. And all he asked in exchange for peace was the right eyeball of every person in the city. Do you remember that? quite a vivid little story. And there's a footnote that comes out of the Dead Sea Scrolls which says he was only doing that because he had already taken every right eyeball on his side of the river, and he was looking to expand onto the other bank. So not a nice enemy. But David offers Hanun a relationship. The son of the eye gouger, shall we be friends? And Hanun may not know it, but this is the promises of God coming true. So if I show you, this is the first promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12. Blessing and a great nation for Abraham, that has come true. But then look at the end. It says, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And that is what is just could be beginning to come true in 2 Samuel 10. The whole Abraham project is about blessing every other nation. It's about reversing the curse of Genesis 3. And all you have to do is make a choice. It's there in the verse on the screen. Bless Abraham, then you are blessed. Curse Abraham, well, then you are cursed. And that is the choice moment that Hanun is making. This could be the beginning of great circles of blessing spreading out from Jerusalem. For Ammon, it would be a kind of coming home. Abraham's nephew comes home inside the blessing. All because the king of kindness refuses to follow the normal playbook. And we'll see actually as the story goes through, we'll see David, he really, really means this. Terrible things happen in this chapter, but David is trying to avoid violence every step of the way. In verse 5, David does nothing against Hanun. All he does is kindness to his humiliated messengers. It's not until Hanun gathers an army, and even then David only does enough to secure his borders. Joab does just enough to scatter the mercenaries and put Hanun back behind his walls. Then verse 14, he comes home. And it's only when David is at risk of total loss that he enters the battle himself in verse 17. What do you think? Would you vote for David? What an unusual, patient, forgiving, sympathetic, honoring king. Remember, all of this, David is showing us what his greater son, Jesus, will need to be. This is all just filling out the job description for Jesus Christ. Last week, we saw he's the king of kindness who keeps his promises, he's full of love, and he cares for everybody's family. This week, the king of kindness who shows patience and restraint and who loves those of other nations, wants to bless and comfort and honor them. It's a great, great picture. But before we get too excited, remember that David is not Jesus. And I hope you will come back next week. But all of those good characteristics, he will throw away in the next chapter. This season of 2 Samuel, it is a tragedy before we meet Jesus in reality. So this morning, we're going to enjoy the last happy chapter for a while. But in that chapter, the key character is Hanun. Because Hanun is an idiot. He's there, and he's there. Trouble is, he's there because we often are idiots. He's there for us to learn from, learn not to be like him. Because Hanun, he thinks he has a better idea. So the king of kindness is rejected. Look down at verse 3 and verse 4. There is a lot going on in verse 3 and verse 4. I think Netflix, they could give this an entire episode. So imagine the scene, some of the scene. There's the new young king welcoming the envoys from David. And then around him, you've got the commanders of the Ammonites. So you imagine David's messengers, they're out being feasted in the main hall and welcomed. And Hanun, he slips into a back room with his dad's generals. And here is a possible response to the kindness of God. They just cannot believe that it is real. Look at verse 3. Do, do you think that David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Hard for Hanun, isn't it? Nobody wants to be a naive idiot in your first week in power. Do you really think this is genuine? Nobody does this. There must be another motive. Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it? That must be the real reason. Does this sound familiar to you? Maybe not all of it, but there is a basic fundamental problem with being a witness of Jesus Christ, isn't there? Wherever you find yourself speaking about the gospel message, do you find this? Because in every other area of life, there is no such thing as a free lunch, is there? I will not do a deal with you unless I understand how you're going to get paid. Because nobody ever acts just because they are kind. Except King Jesus dying on a cross to win forgiveness for his enemies. Have you faced this reaction, the too good to be true reaction? When somebody understands they don't need to earn their favor with God, they don't need to earn their place. Jesus, he is simply kind. And it's left open, I think, whether the commanders have that problem or whether it's only Hanun who has that problem, whether the commanders are lying. It may be that the generals need a war so they can sell some more of their chariots and capture themselves some treasure. But either way, the banquet in the palace suddenly takes a turn. And I imagine anywhere that this chapter is read in schools, maybe they just don't do it. There are giggles and there are laughs, but really, this is horrific, isn't it? Verse 4. So Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. This is more Game of Thrones, isn't it, than the sword in the stone or something like that. There's a vertical cut down the middle of the beard, and then there's a horizontal cut across the middle of the clothes. They don't need to do any of that. There would have been diplomatic ways of doing this, I'm afraid. Hanun thinks it's time for you to go out the back door if you tell David thanks but no thanks. How long do you think verse 4 took? Did Hanun stand up and make some big speech? Did they need translators? Did they not quite understand what was going on when he first began to speak? How drunk was everyone in the room, do you think? Has that feeling to it, doesn't it? What are we going to do? Remember that Hanun's dad has somewhere in the palace a collection of Israelite eyeballs, thousands of them. What are you going to think? You're the envoy as the knife gets closer to your face. How easily do you think you could shave off half of someone's? Is it people in the room with beards? How easy, without, if someone was resisting you, there'd be blood everywhere, wouldn't there? And I think we understand, even from our position thousands of years later, we understand this is violence and shame and fear and horror. Not even sure how long the list of crimes the police would arrest you for on this today. Sexual assault, certainly, isn't it? And in their world, probably this is deliberate religious humiliation. This is like forcing someone to eat pork. And you wonder, how long did the parade last? In their crop tops. You wonder how big the crowd was when they began the walk home. Did soldiers go with them to stop anyone giving them clothes before they arrive back at their own army? Verse 5, when David offers them kindness and sympathy and understanding and honor. But it's shocking, isn't it, what Hanun does? He doesn't just reject, no thank you. He flings it back in David's face as shame and horror. And then in the story, as it goes on, Hanun and everybody else, they just keep doubling down. Every time he has a chance to step back, he pushes forwards until he really is in Psalm 2. And he is gathering whole nations to attack God and his king. So verse 6, it dawns on them, along with the hangover, that David might be a bit upset about this. And we are, I think, shouting at the TV, just stop, ask for peace. This is God's king. It'll be okay, say sorry. But they take the opposite route. They crack open Fort Knox and they hire themselves some mercenaries. In 1 Chronicles 19, we're told this cost them 1,000 talents of silver, which is something like 34 metric tons. And that gets them a lot of soldiers, 33,000 of them. So many that when Joab gets there with David's army, verse 9, he is entirely surrounded. Got 2 or 3 whole national armies facing him and his brother. And his plan, verse 11, is just a little bit desperate, isn't it? Let's split our one small army in half, and if it goes badly with either of us, we'll just come and rescue the other one. What if it goes badly for both of you? One of the commentaries pointed out, who comes to rescue then? Humanly speaking, this is the end. A minor diplomatic incident has got totally out of control. And David's army is going to die in Ammon. And then 33,000 mercenaries are only going to roll in one direction, aren't they? Jerusalem will be wide open, and that is where all the plunder is. Game over when the rulers of the earth gather together against God's king. But if you know the psalm, then you know one of the verses I did not put up on the screen. In the psalm, there is a surprising sound halfway through the song. It is a song, so you could try and do this musically in some way, because the whole earth gathers to reject God's king, like in 2 Samuel 10. And the sound that we hear is the sound of God laughing. There's lots in the Bible about how painful God finds our rebellions. God, he loves us, he wants to do us good, and we throw it back in his face. We cheat on him like an adulterer, we lie about him, we steal from him. But in Psalm 2, God finds all of our rebellions funny. 33,000 Arameans and all of Hanun's army, he treats them like they're the toddlers with the polystyrene swords, because God has made his decision. He's not going to go back on 2 Samuel 7. He has a king, the king of kindness, rejected, and God will have his king. So chapter 10, I said, is all about the escalation. Got a sympathy card from Clinton's cards, which leads to shame and anger, which leads to a huge cash spend on a huge army, which is defeated. More about that in a second, but that leads to more escalation. Joab goes home in verse 14, thinking probably he's done a good job. The Ammonites, they've gone home inside their city. They're not going to be invading, and they've run out of silver, presumably, and the Arameans have run away. Presumably, they'll learn their lesson. This is all over. No. Verse 15. Verse 15 is almost word for word the same as verse 19, because the whole Aramean Empire needs one more go at David before they learn the lesson about God and his king. See, verse 15, they just see all this as terrible for their reputation. If somebody spends 34 tons of silver on 33,000 soldiers and you just run away, that is not good for business, is it? So they decide they cannot make peace. They can't afford to, and they double down. So verse 16, meet a man called King Hadadezer. There are lots of Aramean kingdoms. Here's a sort of map that you just get a sense of the scale on it. You can just about see Jerusalem if you're near to one of the TVs, probably. Very close by to Moab and Ammon. Very close neighbors. All this was a sympathy card through the letterbox of a close neighbor. And then he gets mercenaries from kind of southern Syria to come and help him. You can just about see Syria on that map. And that's a bad thing. That's a major escalation. But after they get humiliated, Hadadezer steps in. And that's why the map has to be so big or so tiny, because Hadadezer is a man with serious reach. Verse 16. Hadadezer had Arameans brought from beyond the river Euphrates. They went to Helam with Shobak, the commander of Hadadezer's army, leading them. So the River Euphrates is the squiggly line that you can just about see at the very top of that map. It's a long, long, long way from Jerusalem. In Bible times, the Euphrates is the big dividing line between the small time and the big time. If you can command both sides of the Euphrates, then you are emperor of the world at that time. And you can tell from verse 18 that Hadadezer has serious imperial rule. And Shobak, he has to be a sort of celebrity soldier. He's the conquering general from the last one. He's on his way here, and David is just a small-time king. If you're paying attention from 5 months ago, you'll have realized that chapter 8, where we finished last time, is just a summary chapter about events that haven't really happened yet, that were now unfolding in chapter 10, 11, and 12. So at this point, David is a small-time king being invaded by the emperor, and it is game over again, except for the laughter of gods. And Joab here is a fascinating character. All through the remainder of this term will be in and out with Joab. He is a fascinating person. He's a soldier's soldier. He's plain speaking. He's nasty at times. But here, he really knows what God has said about his king. So look at verse 12. The theology in the chapter comes from Joab the general. Faced with those 2 or 3 armies, he says to his brother, "Be strong and let us fight bravely." Now, is that just wishful thinking? It's not, because of who they fight for our people and the cities of our gods. It's all about the promises. God has made promises to this people and to these cities since Joseph was carried to Egypt. So Joab, he has confidence, verse 12, that the Lord will do what is good in his sight. Even Joab believes it. And the narrator's question is, do I and do we? Because verse 12 is what happens here. Against the 33,000 and then against the imperial army of more than 41,000, Shobak, the great general, is killed, and an empire has a second look at this small-time king in Jerusalem. And this time they made peace, verse 19. And over the page, still verse, 20-something, these guys, they are never coming back to mess with David again. The Ammonites, they can go and hire someone else this time. So as we close, 3 ways to land this. First, from the perspective of God, God does what is good in his sight. This chapter is a huge step on the way to securing David's borders. But just like the story of Joseph that's all around us in the church, here is one more time when somebody, Hanun this time, intended it for evil, but God used it to do good. Who would have thought that a condolences card would lead to the Syrian Empire deciding to leave David alone forever? Second, from the perspective of God's people, this is the last reassuring chapter before we dive into all the mess and the ruin of David's life. We need this, I think, at this point, because it says that whatever happens, God will have his kingdom of kindness, that the promise stands. God is committed now. Unlike with Saul, he will never take this away from David. We can trust that the kingdom of kindness will come fully. But then finally, third, from the perspective of the rival kings. And remember I said that is me every time I go back to thinking that I could run my life better than he can, which is often, isn't it? In my case, those were even the words I said. Someone taught me to say this on the day I became a Christian. I knelt down and I said, God, I've made a mess of my life. Please come and run it better instead. It's the Psalm 2 choice, isn't it? Kings of the earth, be wise or be foolish. At any point in Hanun's story, this could have gone differently. Psalm 2 is a psalm of second chances, but it is also a psalm of a simple, basic choice. God has decided he will bless those who bless Abraham, and he will curse those who curse him. We can be Mephibosheth, seated at the table as a son, or we can be Hanun in his distrust and his aggression and his rebellion. But either way, whatever we choose, Jesus, he is king. And Jesus, he will be king forever. And blessed are those who take refuge in him. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, Almighty God, we are in awe of the choices that you make, that you have decided on kindness, decided on the death of your son Jesus, but also decided on his resurrection, on his glorious enthronement, that he is king forever. And so, Father, we pray for wisdom in our rebellious hearts, in the hearts of those we love all around us. We ask for the wisdom to make peace with Jesus and to enjoy his blessing and his rescue. In his name, for his glory, we ask. Amen.